Hello. First of all, I want to make it absolutely clear that I don't think Dominic Cummings is Jesus Christ or anything like Jesus. So all you people thinking I'm going to be bringing a religious dimension into this video, I'm telling you, you're wrong straight off. What I'm going to do here is look at some pictures from the late Middle Ages up to about the 17th century and point out some social parallels. The pictures I'm going to be looking at are on a single subject, much repeated by artists at that time and usually called the mocking of Christ. This subject records the New Testament story that when Jesus was arrested by the Roman authorities on the say-so of the Jewish temple priests, the soldiers mocked him as King of the Jews, put an elaborate robe on him, crowned him with a thorn wreath and kicked him about quite a lot. Most artists of the time, that is the Middle Ages, got their commissions from the church, and so they dealt with religious subjects because they had to, but also because the Bible had some bloody good stories that everyone knew. And that helped with the understanding of the picture. People would look at the picture, they'd know what it was about before they'd even gone into looking at how it was depicted. However, the great artists were not just recording the biblical narrative. What made them great was their ability to slip in some commentary about human nature at the same time. So I'm just going to run through a few pictures and point out one or two of these things to you. By the way, if you notice some cuts between artists, it'll be because when I switch from one picture to the next, I might have to cut out the wait time while I get the image into frame. I'm going to try not to do that because I don't like that jerky look, but it might be inevitable here. Now, what I'm going to be showing you is that artists as far back as the 13th century were painting pictures which recorded the mobbing of unpopular people. This mobbing was sometimes instigated by local lords, but more often, much more often, by religious authorities who used mobbing as a means of social control. Here in the modern West, we don't have so many religious authorities with that sort of power, but we do have the great temple of the media and the various priests and priestesses of this great temple. They have done a pretty good job of furthering their own religious beliefs to their devout congregants gathering at the altar of the TV set for the sermon at Evensong.
Good evening. Dominic Cummings broke the rules. The country can see that, and it shocked the government cannot. The longer ministers and Prime Minister tell us he worked within them, the more angry the response to this scandal is likely to be. He was the man, remember, who always got the public mood, who tagged the lazy label of elite on those who disagreed. He should understand that public mood now, one of fury, contempt and anguish. He made those who struggled to keep to the rules feel like fools and has allowed many more to assume they can now flout them. The Prime Minister knows all this, but despite the resignation of one minister, growing unease from his backbenchers, a dramatic early warning from the polls and a deep national disquiet, Boris Johnson has chosen to ignore it. Tonight we consider what this blind...
So, before anyone uses the argument that people 600 years ago didn't really know what Roman soldiers looked like because they didn't have books or photographs, the answer is that although the peasants might have been somewhat underinformed, they weren't ignorant, especially in places where Romans had colonised, because apart from anything else, there was still plenty of statues hanging around and even temples with carvings on them. I will remind you, for instance, that the cult of Epona, the Celtic North horse goddess, adopted by the Romans, that cult persisted into the 14th century that I know about. There were priests complaining about finding offerings in makeshift shrines, especially among people who looked after horses. So these things, knowledge of these things does persist. But that's another story. Anyway, here's a picture from what looks like an altar carving of the 16th century. You can see that the artist definitely knows that Roman soldiers wore short tunics, sandals, and embossed leather armour. Here, look. The helmets are not really, they're more sort of 16th century helmets. And they do all have beards, which would have been unlikely for Roman soldiers at the time. But this person here, I assume he's meant to be Caiaphas, the temple priest, is also dressed sort of in historical clothes. The artists weren't quite sure about the hat, but they did try and imply something. The sort of person or people who made this, I'm assuming it's a church plaque of some sort. This isn't a great artist. This is a workman and not a superstar. But yet he or she, more likely he or they, because it might have been a group who did this, they realised the historical context and they weren't well-educated people. So why do you think that Caravaggio, who was a very well-educated man, would have painted this with a 17th century soldier in modern armour right there? Do you think he was really talking about Jesus? Well, I'll get back to Caravaggio in a little while. Meanwhile, let's step back into the 13th century and Cimabue. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his name. The picture, he's not well known, and this picture was discovered on the kitchen wall of a French peasant who died just a few years ago. You can see that's Jesus, of course, but the people surrounding him, well, are they Roman soldiers? There's certainly a couple of fellas here with swords. But they're not Roman swords. And this chap is dressed in very nice medieval clothes, isn't he? And what's this? A microphone boom? Well, it looks a bit like that to me.
Cummings, what do you say to Steve? Why did you not stay in your primary residence, Mr. Cummings, as the government guidelines state? Why did you go 260 miles across the country? What do you say to
No, they're not Roman soldiers. They're ordinary people doing what Cimabue must himself have seen happening to people in villages, people who got on the wrong side of the local priest. Now, there's another one here by Giotto. Here we are. And he's making the same comment, for sure. Pontius Pilate is there. There's Pontius Pilate and the priest Caiaphas. Well, but these guys, they're not Roman soldiers, although you'll no doubt be happy to see that Giotto was woke when it came to making the point that black people can be as bad as white people. You see, Giotto was painting his stuff in the 1300s, by the way. So this picture dates to about 80 or 100 years after Cimabue. Nothing's changed in that time, but hey, that was the Middle Ages. Surely we got better with the passing years. So here's Fra Angelico. Angelico was himself a priest, which might account for the fact that we don't see any priests as the bad guys in this picture. Well, not obviously priests anyway, but there are plenty of fashionable, sophisticated, Florentine young men all having a great time beating a blindfolded man. Well, All right, that was still the Middle Ages, sort of. Angelico was working in the 15th century mostly. So let's continue up the ladder of history. And here we have Begaert, about 50 years after Angelico, I suppose. He was a Netherlandish painter, so the style is different. And Dutch paintings, Dutch artwork was always less sort of artistic and more raw. I happen to like that style rather, but some people found it a little primitive. And he does have some trouble with perspective. But he doesn't have any trouble at all recording the people who are tormenting Jesus, wearing their fashionable boots and their fine wool hose and their stylishly slashed jackets with the wide lapels. Ho hum. Onwards and upwards. Things must have got better in the 16th century, mustn't they? Here's Procaccini. Let's see, Procaccini, here we are. Oops, well, those guys don't look like Roman soldiers either. That's definitely a pair of 16th century breeches this fellow is wearing. So let's see what else we have. Albrecht Dürer, my hero, by the way, one of my favourite artists and definitely a hero to me. Okay, well, this chap might be Caiaphas. He's wearing a somewhat exotic hat. I'm not really an expert on 17th century fashionable hats, but he's certainly wearing the clothes of a fashionable 17th century man about town. And these people here in the ragged shoes, well, they are about as much 17th century German peasants as it's possible to be. All right, so let's go further up the 17th century to von Hornthorst. This is an amazing painting, although I know there are a lot of purists who would have issues with the composition. But just look at that face. Isn't it amazing? But even more, look at this face. Is this the face of a Roman soldier or the face of, well, just for the sake of argument, a journalist who's backed up by a pack of journalists and revelling in the glee of having someone to bully who can't fight back? In this picture, Jesus is there, but he's also standing in for anyone who's been mobbed, anyone. Now back to Caravaggio. Again, I'm not saying Cummings is Jesus. Of course, he couldn't be anywhere near. But that's exactly what Caravaggio is saying here. Here's the policeman at the side who's there to make sure that the other guys doing the dirty work don't go too far. So the only thing I've left to point out is that although I doubt there's an artist who could manage to produce a picture like this in our advanced modern world, we can look on the bright side. We can still manage the same mobs pretty well.
It's time to go. Today.
Just do us all a favour and leave.
Depressing, isn't it? If you want to donate or contact, the information will be rolling over the Graniopteryx as I speak. Please like, subscribe and share because it does help with the algorithm. If you visit my channel on YouTube and one day discover that I've disappeared without warning, you'll still find me on Bitchute or Minds. Just go to either of those platforms and do a search for Graniopteryx. If you're already watching this on Bitchute or Minds, good for you. Meanwhile, if you're watching this on YouTube, remember that you must keep checking the subscribe and bell icons because occasionally they reset. Till next time.